Welcome to the next video in the series, What is Codex Urdalinda? In this episode, I present the story of Kelta and Minerva, the civil war started by their dispute, and the nascence of two major world cultures that resulted. Remember that we have begun by accepting Codex Urdalinda at face value, not yet distinguishing in any way the historical veracity of the narrative. Anyone who has read Codex Urdalinda in any depth knows that factionalism plagued the people of Frya's land increasingly over time. Political debates often led to arguments, which in some cases gave rise to violence and massive societal discord. In a manner reminiscent of the modern political game, leaders of the various cultural movements were skilled rhetoricians and socio-political tacticians, using an array of tools and techniques to manufacture consent and mobilize their supporters to bring forth sweeping changes for the benefit of their cause, often to their own personal advantage. One early instance of this was the agitation of burgmaid Kelta against burgmaid Minerva, two candidates for the post of Volksmother following the death of an unnamed predecessor. The outcome of the conflict would go on to have far-reaching consequences for the realm of Frya's land, and eventually for the course of world history. To most viewers, the names of these two burgmaids will have a familiar ring. Kelta, after her estrangement from the Frya homeland, as will be described in this video, saw her followers banished to Brittany in what is now northwestern France and the Isles of Britannia, where they called themselves the Keltas, or Celts. The word Brit is a Fryas word meaning, roughly, to be delivered from ultimate punishment, in other words, death. Those who had committed a crime punishable by death could, if their burgmaid agreed, be Brit away into a life of banishment, living as exiles in the lands called Britannia, or lands of the banished, where they worked in the tin mines to pay for their crimes. The Celts were eventually banished in this way on the command of the Volksmother for their role in Kelta's insurrection. Kelta herself, as we shall later learn, fled to the southern regions of Europe, returning with a foreign force to reassert her control over the Celts and other banished Brits. Minerva and her followers, for their part, managed to escape banishment with the help of a sea king named Jon, eventually landing with their massive fleet at Attica in Greece. Section 9a of Codex Urdalinda begins.
Now we will write about the war of the burgmaids, Kelta and Minerva, and how we thereby lost all our southern lands and Britannia to the Gola.
The Gola referred to here were the missionary priests of the great Phoenician maritime city of Sidon, who also referred to themselves in the Fryas language as TRO-WIDS in their dealings with the burgmaids and the mothers. TRO-WIDS means roughly those dedicated to truth and faith. After gaining a colonial foothold at Massalia in present-day Marseille, the Gola had fervently set about to convert the inhabitants of the sparsely populated southern regions of Europe to their religion, with its elaborate sacrificial rites and festivals, gradually spreading their way of life westward along the coast. After the war between Kelta and Minerva, the Gola would eventually become the primary cultural driver all the way up to Brittany and the British Isles. Etymologically, the Latin name Gallia, or Gaul, for what is now France and Belgium, is derived from this cultural spread. The story of Kelta and Minerva rightly begins in what is now the Dutch province of Zeeland, at the burg called Valhallagora, likely the namesake for the island of Walcheren, where Minerva had her seat as burgmaid. She was well respected and considered wise, both by the common folk and the leadership throughout the realm, earning her the epithet Nihilenia, which can be translated roughly as she who introduces enlightened wisdom. Minerva was thus ranked second in line of succession by the recently deceased Volksmother, after Rosamunda, who had been named the primary successor in the prior mother's will. Across the water from Minerva's burg at Walcheren, Sirheit was the name of a burgmaid whose domain consisted of the area around a burg called Vlieburg, possibly located at modern-day Oostburg in Belgium, south of the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt delta. Her reputation was less favorable, and the seafaring navigators, the most influential social grouping in the culture of Fryas land, had an unflattering nickname for her, Kelta, meaning approximately she who speaks empty words. This will also be the name used here for clarity. A spat arose between the two burgmaids as Kelta vied with Minerva for popular support and proximity to the coveted seat of the Volksmother in Tesland. What began as a symbolic battle between the two, waged through words and emblems, would, however, soon escalate to the point where the lives of common people were at stake in the struggle for their loyalties. Kelta covertly turned to help from foreign powers, first from the priests of the Magyar, a tribe that masterfully blended deception, superstition, and violence to conquer lands progressively from the east, and had already taken control of the Finns, and then from the Sidonian priests, the Gola. After a time, having learned many skills of craft from both, Kelta unleashed a campaign of utter might against Minerva and her supporters, especially the navigators, whom she despised for their devotion to Minerva, but desired fervently to win over given their preeminent position within the power base.
When she realized that the navigators only shunned her more and more, she sought to entice them through fear. Whenever the moon was full and the sea stormy, she would go out, treading the wild swells, shouting at the seafarers that they should all perish if they would not worship her. She also blinded their eyes, causing them to mistake land for water and water for land, so that many a ship was lost with man and mouse.
Such displays of her newfound powers served to disaffect the northerners and the seafarers, and Kelta grew increasingly deranged in her quest for control. Eventually, at the next annual festival, she used her power of speech along with a brewed potion to cast a spell upon her followers. After drugging them into a stupor, Kelta played on their economic woes and fears, skillfully whipping them into a mad frenzy to exhort them to go forth across the mudflats at low tide and attack Minerva's burg.
On the other side of the Scheldt, where ships from almost all seas pass by, they nowadays make riding felt from water lily leaves. Thus they no longer use linen and have no more need of us. The making of riding felt has always been our chief industry, so the mother would have wanted them to teach us the new craft too. But Minerva has bewitched all the folk. Yes, bewitched, my friends, even as all our cattle that died recently. It must be made known, and I will tell you this. If I were not a burgmaid, I know what I would do. I would burn that witch in her nest.
Jon was a great sea king and navigator who commanded a fleet numbering more than 100 ships that plied trade routes across the breadth of Fryas land, from the furthest reaches of the Baltics to the Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar and beyond. When, upon starting on an expedition, he reached the port of Walcheren, likely the harbor now called Vlissingen, or Flushing, and learned that Minerva's burg had been sacked, he sent men to rescue Minerva, her maidens, and the sacred lamp, while setting off with the rest of the fleet to assail Kelta's burg and bring her to face justice. As a civil war broke out between Jon's navy and the army Kelta had gathered round herself, the Volksmother Rosamunda called a state of emergency and assembled a guard force, which she sent to quell the violence and arrest all who took part. But Jon still had his fleet, which took ship as soon as they learned that they were to be charged with insurrection, and fled with the inhabitants of Minerva's burg, stopping only to collect their own wives and children before setting out on a desperate escape that eventually led them to the shores of distant Greece, while the followers of Kelta and anyone else left behind were banished to the mines of Britannia. Kelta herself, meanwhile, fled southward over land and redoubled her alliance with the Gola, who sailed in force northward to her aid. Upon returning to the north, she again used her craft and trade to win the allegiance of the banished men sentenced to work in the tin mines, and commissioned the building of a new burg at Carnac, from which she ruled over what is now northern France and perhaps the British Isles. Her people called themselves Celtas, but because her followers lacked established infrastructure and other cultural resources, her grip was so tenuous that the Gola quickly usurped her position of mastery over them, winning them over to their form of sacrificial religion through the many women and girls they abducted and brought into the lands of the banished. The Romans later called this region Gallia Celtica, part of the greater realm of Gaul that had by then transformed all the lands from the coasts of the North Sea to the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Though any archaeologists, anthropologists, and other academics watching this video will surely scoff at its absurdity, this history as presented may provide many interesting clues to unsolved phenomena. For instance, the seeming linguistic connection between Gaelic and Semitic languages. In the next video, we'll find out how Jon and Minerva made their way with the fleet all the way to the Phoenician coast, eventually parting ways with one another and setting up separate cultural bastions in Athens and Ionia.